Throughout his Senate career, Chris was known not just for what he passed, but how he showed up, his warmth, his wit, and a willingness to listen. So in an era of sound bites and scorched earth, his style reminds us that politics is personal. It's about presence. It's about showing up for colleagues, for constituents, and for causes, even when the camera is not rolling. So, Chris, thank you for joining me today and joining our listeners today on the podcast. Your father, Thomas Dodd, was a U.S. Senator. So I wanted to start out by just talking a little bit about your growing up in a political family and what that did to shape your view of public service and your entry into politics.
Well, that's first of all, Tim, thanks for doing this. I think it's fun. We actually overlapped for a while, both in the Senate. I was in the Senate. You were in the House as well. Your brother, distinguished governor. In fact, remind me to tell me a story about Asa when I was the head of the Motion Picture Association. It was a great help to me when Coach Broyles was the issue of name and how they use people's names. So so many things go back in memory along the thing. I was fortunate. My father's public life began in 1933. He was 38 years old. He'd been at the Justice Department about 12 years. And he was asked to go to Nuremberg, Germany, to do interrogations of the first defendants in the first trial in Nuremberg in 1945 and 46. He became the executive trial counsel for Justice Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor for the United States. So at 38 years old, he's in Nuremberg, Germany for 2 years, came home once, and that time on a Christmas vacation for a few days. And it really began, I don't have it in front of me today, Tim, but let me just try to paraphrase. He wrote my mother every day, some 400 letters in those 2 years. And in the last letter, one of the last letters he wrote to my mother, as a much older person, 2 years later, than he was in his first letters in 1945, he said to my mother in the letter, "I will never do anything as important again as what we've done here." And I want you to know that's how I feel about all of this. I didn't feel that way when I began, but I realized we're involved in something bigger than ourselves. The rule of law. We had to learn sort of a phrase of Justice Jackson's opening speech at Nuremberg, which was that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stayed the hand of vengeance by voluntarily submitting their captive enemies to the judgment of the rule of law, one of the greatest tributes that power ever paid to reason. That was in his opening remarks, Justice Jackson at Nuremberg. So that's when my father's public life began. He ran for Congress in 1953 and won in 1952. There were a handful of Democrats elected in the Eisenhower landslide. And then in 1954, he ran. He got elected in 52 and elected in 54. My father was the only Democrat in the congressional delegation from Connecticut in those 2 years, 4 years.
How things have changed.
Yeah, 56, he ran for the Senate. He lost to Prescott Bush, the father and grandfather of 2 presidents, 43 and 41. And then in 58, he ran again and won. And then he served in 64. He was reelected. And in 70, he was defeated, ran as an independent in Connecticut, and he died 6 months after the election at age 62. So it was an eventful life, those 38 years from 1948, but also died very young. And but I wanted to tell you one anecdote that I thought of a lot over the years. And right when the worst times were going for him, he was interviewed by a woman. I remember Sue Nichols was her name, from the New Haven Register. And she said to my father, I was sitting in the room paying attention, but not terribly, not with every word being uttered. But she asked him the following question. She said, in the end, he lost his election. He got accused of various things. It hurt badly, my mother and he. And she said, Senator, if you had to do it all again and you knew when you started out how it would end up, what would you do? And I remember I put down whatever I was kind of looking at. I wasn't always going to answer that. Before I could finish the thought, he said, I'd do it again in a minute. And obviously, why? And he said, there's no other calling in life when you can make such a difference in other people's lives as in public life, public service. I've never forgotten that moment. was 1970. It's many years ago. But I thought, my Lord, if my father could say that after all these years in different roles, that he still looks back and says some good things we did
Yeah.
along the way. That was enough of an incentive in many ways. I didn't know I'd end up running for public office at that particular point at all. But nonetheless, I remember it kept with me for years and years, that one sentence he made to that reporter, that he'd do it again in a minute because he knew of no other calling where he could make such a difference. Sort of like your life, Tim, in many ways. I went back over looking your own career and distinguished career as it was. And I love the fact that you were the first Republican elected to the Senate since Reconstruction. No one believes me when I tell them that.
I know both of our states have changed dramatically. So I was fascinated about learning about your time in the Dominican Republic. I should have known, but tell us about memories or what impact that may have had on your life. I mentioned that in the introduction, but just tell us.
It changed my life. I was in the Army as well afterwards, but the experience that really altered my life. I grew up in a middle-class family, put aside the politics, one of 6 children, and they're like everyone else, I suppose, in their senior year of college. You go, what am I going to do next? And I read about this organization called the Peace Corps, which was very young at the time. It had been started only a few years earlier. And I was so intrigued by the idea that when I applied for it, I didn't know you could ask for a specific country. They said, where do you want to serve? I said, anywhere in Asia, Latin America, or Africa, which is pretty much the world. And I didn't know where I'd go, but they sent me to the Dominican Republic. And the day I arrived, they dropped me off. I didn't really know where I was being dropped off, in a little village up in the mountains of the Dominican Republic, not far from the Haitian border, in a little village called Benito Monsión. And for the next 2+ years, I lived in that small town by myself. There were no other Americans in the village at all. I didn't speak Spanish. I was 22 years old. I didn't know what I was supposed to really do, but I quickly learned that you need to listen. If I learned any great lesson from the service, was not only I had to listen because I wasn't that good in Spanish to begin with, so I didn't know what I'd say in many cases. But listening became a key ingredient I learned from that experience. And it was, I still talk to them. In fact, not because of this talk we're having, Tim, but yesterday I regularly call families that have moved to the United States from that village. And so yesterday I talked to Carmen Alvarez and her daughter Nicia, as I do with some regularity, on how they're doing. And they were just wonderful friends of mine when they were there in that village many years ago and emigrated to the United States and are doing a wonderful job in this country. So it was a great experience and changed my life in the sense that I never really thought about public service, and I wasn't thinking about running for Congress or something. But I liked what I'm doing. Steve Jobs, of all people, when he was asked the question by some young people, what do you think I ought to do with my life? We've all been asked that question by young people in public life. And normally we answer, well, do something you love. Steve Jobs said, that's the wrong answer. That's not a good answer. He said, the right answer is do something you're good at. And if you're good at it, you'll love it. If you're bad at it, you're going to hate it. So try it out. What do you do? What are you good at in a very broad sense? And follow that dream in a sense. And you'll end up in better shape. Others may disagree, but I've always been sort of intrigued by Steve Jobs' point of view on what to look forward to. So I liked public service. I liked this village. I worked on a maternity hospital, a library. I built a school. I had a youth club, little boys club. I met great friends in that village and elsewhere in the country, but principally in Benito Monsión. And I brought a bunch of my colleagues in Congress to Benito Monsión for 2 days one time when I was in Congress. Went to the Dominican Republic, and I took them up to my village up in the mountains. So
that's amazing. What a story. Now, I've always been impressed with how something like that in our lives can have such an impact. Yeah. I've heard Tim Kaine talk about the time he did missionary work and how that has changed his life. I did only 8 days in Haiti. You did 2 years. 8 days I was in Haiti, and it left a lasting impact just spending that week there and seeing all the great needs.
I believe it, Tim. I used to go when we get a few days off. Every month or two, they'd give us a few days. I went to Haiti all the time. Mainly to Port-au-Prince, although I went up to Cape Haitian as well over time, because again, it's all the same island and was
Yeah.
fairly easy to get to. But I fell in love with the country and the people, most wonderful people in so many ways. They were generous and kind, a great history, a fascinating history of their own. There were Haitians who fought in the American Revolution. Uh, they achieved their independence shortly
Yep.
after our own.
Yep.
When Simon Bolivar lost to the Spanish initially, the one country that took him in was Haiti,
Yeah.
and helped him retrain and regroup to go back. So it's hard to believe, and there's such tension between the two. I won't bore you with all the stuff about it, but I'm so glad you had that experience. Mike DeWine and his wife started an orphanage in Haiti. In fact,
Knowing Mike, I'm not
I'm not
surprised.
surprised either, and I'm not surprised.
So let's move the conversation to your
Yeah.
time in the Senate. I'd love you served with some giants in the Senate over the span of your career, and I would put in that category as one of the giants. Do you have any stories about individuals that made a big impression upon you, impact upon your thinking or your life? And also maybe moments of bipartisanship where you worked across the aisle.
Well, there are, and many of them. And it was the difference is today people are fascinated that there was a time when we functioned that way. There was nothing surprising about it when I served. This was normal behavior. Uh, so there were several I can think of. Uh, Jake Garn was a great friend of mine. I'm married to a Mormon, and Jake loved the fact that I became sort of the mission for Jake Garn. Orange Hatch from Utah as well. Uh, uh, Certainly Howard Baker. I lived so the diversity. But John Warner and I were competing for the construction of a submarine. Newport News in Virginia, Groton, Connecticut, of course, the submarine capital. John was, of course, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, former Secretary of the Navy. He had all the tools. I wasn't even on the Armed Services Committee. I was on the Banking Committee and the Labor Committee with you. And I went to work at it. I worked hard trying to make the case on why we had the expertise to build this new class, the Seawolf submarine. And I remember the day when the decision was announced. I was going down to the shipyard. I always believed on good news and bad news, you got to be there. Don't just get there with the good news. And on the way down, I learned that we had won the contract over John Warner and Newport News. And that night, I went back to Washington, and I'm walking down the corridor of my apartment, and I noticed there was something against my door. And I looked at it and opened it up, and it was from John Warner, and it was a first edition copy of Jack London's The Seawolf, autographed by John to me. Then there was a bottle of wine. I'm not sure what it was, but apparently with a note from John saying you did a great job. Congratulations. Now, that was somewhat unique in a way, but not entirely in many ways. I
Right.
mean, this was we had a competition. It was a friendly competition. Obviously, people making those decisions. There was no reason to, be for me or a good reason to be with John, but they made a different decision. So that was one example. John Ashcroft and I were friends. And John Ashcroft called me one morning and said, would you give me a vote to be Attorney General? I said, well, sure. I probably should have waited a day or something to think about it. But I didn't. I said, sure. Well, I don't need to tell you, Tim. I got a deluge of calls saying you couldn't possibly do that. But I was also a great believer your word was important in the Senate. You could get a retro reputation very quickly if you went back on your word and didn't
Yeah.
detail the member and so forth. So that was a moment as well. I don't regret it. John Ashcroft, in many ways, saved the Constitution.
Yeah.
The courageous act he had one evening in a sickbed in a hospital. So those were a couple. I'm looking to see if there was a couple more.
Well, those are remarkable. I've often hear about the relationship between Ted Stevens and Inouye, Senator Inouye, how close they were, what close friends they were across the aisle. And I hope that this podcast can maybe encourage those kinds of relationships to be formed I don't know if it's possible in the current environment, but I hope this can help.
I agree with you totally on that. You're so right. It's the serving in the Senate. The founders weren't trying to create a spare in case the House fell down or disappeared. You got another chamber you can go to. It was all of the construction of a democracy. And the key to a democracy is compromise. Now, none of us have ever run for public office saying, elect me, I'm a great compromiser. People don't
No,
want to hear that. But then
no,
nonetheless,
especially today.
at the end of the
Yeah.
day, if you don't compromise, democracy fails. And so none of us want to do it. We start out in something we believe in strongly. But in the end of the day, if we don't go for it, I'm a great supporter of the filibuster. And it needs to be changed a bit. But the idea was you got to set up a system whereby at some point or another, the Senate has to make a decision, either to go forward or call it a day and quit and move on. When the days really existed, no bill, nothing could happen on the floor of the Senate until the filibuster issue was resolved. So everybody, all of us paid a price for that. But there was also an end game and how to get to it with a cloture
Yeah.
vote and so forth. So I worry, I know it's unpopular with other people, but I don't think they know about civics as much as they should. And the idea of having a place where you can cool things down and think twice and
Yeah.
sort of force people to sit with each other and try to work it out. So,
Well, the filibuster does just that. It forces compromise,
yeah,
and once you've been in the minority, you appreciate the need for the protection of the rights of the minority because
absolutely.
the Senate goes back and forth.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. You're so right. So right.
Well, you mentioned the need for compromise. We both served on the Health Committee, the
Right.
Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and one of my closest friends in the Senate was Mike Enzi from Wyoming.
Sure.
And Mike had a great relationship with Ted Kennedy.
Yep.
Now, I doubt they could have been further apart on their political views or their constituencies. They were very, very different, but they had an agreement that if they could reach an agreement on 80% of a substance, they'd pass legislation, and they let that 20% where they disagreed to fall to the wayside. And they accomplished a lot. They got a lot of legislation
Yep.
passed because they were willing to try to find that common ground. I think we need that today.
I'll tell you another great anecdote. When I wrote the first child care bill since World War II, to provide for child care funding, it wasn't a lot of money back in the 80s. But Bob Dole, who I loved, by the way, and he would give me, I forget the number, let's say it was $6 million. He said, I'll give you 3, but you're not going to get the 6. Teddy was with me for this meeting. I'm being a real jerk. I'm not yelling, but I was new to the place, and I didn't realize there are rhythms to the place. And Dole was kind of insistent upon it. Teddy leaned over to me right in the meeting, and he gave me one of these, Tim, if you can see this. He said, let's have a timeout. And he took me out in the hallway, and he said, now listen, you take Bob Dole's offer. If not, he's going to defeat you and beat you. Then you got to start all over again maybe next year. So it's not everything you want, but it's a start. So you take the half price, whatever it was he offered at the time. And I went back in and I followed Teddy's advice. Just a classic example of Teddy Kennedy's ability. But one more anecdote I'll tell you about him. He
Yeah,
would always have,
I love the stories. Keep them coming.
well, I don't know whether you attended one or not, but Teddy would have the Labor Committee over for dinner at his house before session began, usually in January, February. And it was just members, no staff, no family, just the members of the committee. And I remember my first one I went to, Orrin Hatch, I think it was Orrin Hatch was the ranking minority member at the time in the committee. And I was curious when he finished our main meal, what we were eating, having a lot of fun and talking. He'd say, well, let's come to order here and think about some things. He said, let me start around the room. And he turned to Orrin. He said, Orrin, tell me what your 2 or 3 things the most important to you are that you'd like to get done this year. And he would start with Republicans, and he'd go around and ask everyone the same question. And then, he had his issues and so forth. But one way or another, Orrin Hatch would get 1 or 2 or whatever the number was of his issues. He'd get it done. Teddy would make sure he got it done. And it was because he understood, I'll tell
They became fast friends.
And I'll tell you a great anecdote, Tim, that I had not heard before until a couple of years ago. It's 1962. Ted Kennedy is on the Judiciary Committee. Jim Eastland of Mississippi is the chairman of the committee, the Judiciary Committee. Eastland had a rule that if you showed him you had enough votes, he would allow your issue to come up on the calendar. But you had to show you had a majority. And then he said, I'll try and defeat you on the amendment, but I'll give you a chance to be heard. So Teddy went to him and had a barest margin of 1 vote in favor of whatever his amendment was he wanted to offer. And so when the vote occurred, Teddy lost by one vote. And it was obviously a Democrat who had voted against him in this thing. And so Jim Eastland said to the senator, whoever it was, now I don't know the name, did you tell Teddy that you were going to vote against him? No, I thought I made up my own mind. I didn't have to tell him. Well, let me tell you, you broke a cardinal rule in this institution, and that's your word. You're keeping your word. You broke your word. You didn't tell him you had changed your mind, which is fair, but you just cast a vote without telling him. He said, so let me say something. Mr. Clerk, how am I recorded? This is Jim Eastland. And the clerk says, you're recorded as no. He goes, change my vote to aye, and pass Teddy's amendment, whatever it was. And to teach that new senator, that if you make a word, you make a commitment, you live up to your commitments. And it was
What
not
an
a written rule,
amazing story.
not a written rule anyways,
I love hearing the stories. I love hearing about the relationships and the friendships, and I pray for the day we'll have more of those. I always remember, because I served with Conrad Burns, the late senator from Montana, and I was taken aback when he told me that his best friend in the U.S. Senate was Dale Bumpers, the senator from Arkansas, and farther apart politically they could not have been, but they were both great storytellers, and they both loved each other.
Yeah. Well, you've had some great members, and and of course I've gone to. In fact, I saw you at Dale's. I think you were at that funeral in Little Rock, and I went down for David Pryor's, and I went down for Dale's. Went down. I was across the country, and again, this was not about D's and R's. I'll never forget the funeral service because it was Bill Clinton was there, and people started telling stories, and of course Arkansas stories. They weren't telling stories about NATO or the Pacific Rim. It was just good old local stories, and it was a riot. It was humorous. It was heartwarming to hear people who had been political opposites but sat there talking about their state with great affection and respect for each other as well. So I think of it often.
I could spend forever talking about President Clinton, but spending 8 years in the Arkansas legislature, he was governor, and then spending 10 years in Washington, and he was president 8 of those 10 years, and going through impeachment and that trial. But when we were at that funeral, he gave me the biggest hug at the reception, and he never held a grudge. I could tell a lot of stories. I won't today. But I appreciate the spirit that you've brought to our conversation. One last question. We'll wrap it up. If you were to write a letter today to your younger self, as a young man and looking forward to a political career, what would you tell yourself? I think the young people today would value hearing it.
Well, one more anecdote for you, Tim. I won't go too long.
Never too many.
Maybe one of the most important meetings I ever attended in the Senate was in the old Senate chamber that had been restored. And it was on the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And no staff, no family. We gathered in that old Senate chamber because we understood that the Senate was going to be on trial too. And how we deported ourselves, how we conducted ourselves would have an awful lot to do whether or not we earn the respect of the American people who are going to be watching it closely. And I'll never forget that Ted Kennedy, I spoke once, but Ted Kennedy spoke and Phil Gramm and got up together and said, we went on and just talked about the very points and made such a huge impression on me at the point. Two people who never agreed, I don't think, on anything,
right,
but got up and understood the importance and shared their stories with us about how we ought to try and do this. So it was one of those great moments.
Senator Daschle talked about that moment as well. And I told him, I said, after Phil Gramm and Kennedy reached, they agreed, and they said, well, if those two can agree, let's do it. And somebody shouted out, seal the deal. And then they, as Tom said, as they left, he turned over to Trent, leaned over to him and says, what we just agree to. But they figured it out, and it was a magical moment for sure. Thanks for sharing that.
Oh, that chamber. Well, listen, if I'm writing a note, I thought a lot about it because I've answered the question not in the same way you've answered it. But the big lesson from the Peace Corps going forward and so forth was to be a better listener. I did it by accident. I'd love to tell you I paid money for a brilliant consultant. But in 1974, when I ran for Congress in the Watergate class, that huge class of Democrats, I had brochures we handed out. Not much. We didn't have any fancy technology like today. But I didn't know what to put on the brochure. And I went through some pictures we had, and it was always me talking, talking to a young person, talking to an elderly person. And I said, you can't just send pictures. If all we got is me talking, then it's going to be terrible. Well, they said, don't worry about it, because we have almost no pictures of you talking. We have you pictures of you listening. And that's not a bright thing to be doing. You're supposed to be talking. I said, well, that's all I got. So my slogan was, Chris Dodd is a good listener. And 74. The Peace Corps taught me a lot about that for the reason I told you earlier, because I didn't speak the language. I had to learn it there and so forth. And being a good listener, we sometimes fail to recognize most of us want to be heard there. And we want you to listen to me when I tell you why I'm for X, Y, or Z. And to me, that was the important lesson I fell into it by accident, really, in 74. But I continued to use it over the next 36 years in public elections. My father and I went through 9 statewide elections in Connecticut, starting in the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, in the first decade of the 21st century. And the best message I came away with all those years is be a good listener. What's that great line by Maya Angelou? I can't remember what you said, but I remember how you made me feel.
Yeah.
And
I think that's a good note and a good reminder for anybody, but young people especially.
Yeah.
So in an era that often rewards volume over virtue, Chris has reminded us that quiet conviction still matters. His legacy isn't just written in legislation. It's etched in friendships and moments of bipartisan grace and the belief that public service is a calling, not a contest. Today's conversation was more than a look back. It was a reminder of what's possible when decency leads and dialogue endures. So from Connecticut to Arkansas, from committee rooms to cigar lounges, the bridge of friendship endures. And for that, I'm grateful. And Senator Dodd, I'm very grateful that you'd spend this time with us.
Not at all, to my thank you immensely. So glad you're doing this. And I wish more people would do it. And because it's a wonderful way. We don't see each other. We don't get a chance to talk to each other as often, no matter our intentions. And I think letting people know that there was a time, not ancient history. There are a lot of reasons why it's happened. There's not a single reason why it's occurred. But we've got to get back to it. And nothing less than democracy is at stake and how we do this. And
Amen.
People's lives. And the founders will now be celebrating next year the 250th anniversary of this effort. Understood it was a republic we were creating, and we had to listen to each other and come together to try and resolve problems on behalf of the people we represented. And so my hope is we'll get back to that and understand it's making the difference. First of all, the good people are not going to stay in the place if they can't be a part of getting something right. And we were rewarded for it. I'm sure you were in Arkansas and I was in Connecticut, that if I did something, I worked with something, and I did a lot of time. Mitch McConnell and I wrote a piece of legislation, the HELP bill, after the 2000 election. He was my partner. We spent a long time. I often said about him, he was both beautiful and difficult to negotiate with. He was a tough negotiator. He argued about everything. And we'd had days and weeks we went on trying to write that bill. When we wrote it, and he was on the Appropriations Committee, every nickel of the money we said would get to poor counties across the country to improve their voting machines and access to voting. So Mitch fought for every penny of that money as an appropriator. And he fought me tooth and nail in trying to get what we're trying to get done. But that's the way it's supposed to work, in a sense.
Yeah. Chris, thank you so much.
To do this.
It's been an honor to have you. God bless you.
I like doing it too. It's fun to go back and think of some memories too.
It's been a pure delight. Thank you so much. The Dominican Republican, learning Spanish, listening deeply, and living simply. That experience didn't just shape his worldview, it shaped his tone,